to do something as cool as that. So thank you all so much for coming, or at least for logging in. This is a presentation that I have given for several years to my students here at Western Washington, and it's something that I think those of us who have been sort of out of school for a little while have forgotten that it's not obvious how one goes about the process of applying to graduate programs. Probably, I'm assuming many of you who are out there listening are currently undergraduate students or maybe have recently graduated out of various programs. And the process that you went through when you applied to your undergraduate school is going to turn out to be really different from the one that you're going to use if you consider graduate programs. And it was a while before I realized that my students didn't really know that, and that it would be beneficial to kind of help them understand what the differences would be. So for example, when you applied to your undergraduate school, you might have said, boy, I've heard that this school is really great in geology, or more likely you had no idea geology existed and you said this is really great in some other field and found geology. You might have said, I know that, it has clubs that I'm interested in, a sporting team that I like, it's in a region that I like. And you're going to approach your graduate program in a different manner. And so the goal here is to talk about that. The opening slide, assuming everybody can see that, is just to let you know that there is PhD comics out there, because if you go to graduate school or if you're considering it, this turns out to be your best and snarkiest intro to what the experience is like, and it's super fun. And I've stolen liberally from that page just for some graphics, and you'll see those as we go. So I'm going to start off just talking about how you decide where to apply to grad school. We'll talk a little later about, whether you should go, etc. But again, when you looked at your undergrad school, you might have looked for region, you might have looked for prestige, etc. And that's a little different here, because instead of looking at the school you most want to attend, your focus is going to be on the person with whom you want to work. So the homework that you do is going to be different. It's not just going to be looking at rankings of schools, although that might matter to you. For some people, that's quite important. But you're also going to say, I'm really excited by the research that this person is doing in the field that I'm interested in. So you're going to apply to work with a specific advisor. You might apply to work with a research group, and in fact, it can be beneficial to know there are several options for you at a given school, because maybe you and your advisor will think very differently. Maybe that relationship won't work out in the way that you'd hoped. So if there's someone else who's a backup or other people who will serve as sort of good support for your research, that's great. But ultimately, you're going to be looking to work with a specific person. Even more than that, you're going to be looking to work on a specific project. And so we'll talk about how you might go about finding out what those projects are and what interests you. This doesn't mean you have to come up with a project. Often somebody will say, hey, I've got a project that's waiting for a student to work on. When we write grants for funding for our own research, we'll often say, and I want to include funding for a student. So we'll have an idea of a project, and we're looking for students who are interested in working on them. In terms of how to find that advisor, I'll get to that in just a second. So if you're worried about, I don't know how to do that, just sit tight 1 second. I promise we'll get there. I will say that often, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and I'll tell you that many of my students don't want to leave the Pacific Northwest. That may be true for many of you in areas that you live in. And they say, well, I only want to apply to schools right here because I love it here. And I'm really going to urge people to not make location a huge emphasis for you. Graduate school is temporary, hopefully. You're not going to stay there forever. So this is a chance to really focus on your studies and focus on the really the best fit project and advisor for you, and not worry if it's a place you don't see yourself spending your life. You might be surprised by what's out there, and this is a great opportunity to test that. I'll also point out that you don't have to do your research in the area that you are attending school. I happened to do research in the same area. I attended the University of Hawaii for my graduate program, and I did study Hawaiian volcanoes. But I had colleagues working in Chile. I had grad student friends who were working in Antarctica. There were people working on Mars. There were people working all over, quite literally, the solar system. So don't worry if you're interested in a program in Florida, but the research you hope to do is in Italy. things like this can happen. So location is just where you're based temporarily. So one of the important things you do have to decide is what type of degree you want. So I've got 3 listed on the screen here. Um, there's an MS is a Master's of Science. PSM is something called a Professional Science Master's, and then there's a PhD. And the reasons for these are going to have to do in part with what you see yourself doing down the line. Some of them have to do with whether you feel like you want to jump into a PhD program right after that, or even whether you're welcome to. So a master's is typically a couple of years, research-based. Hopefully you'll have kind of a confined project that you can tackle and be done with in a couple of years, and you'll have coursework to do as well to gain expertise in that field. A professional science master's is likely also 1 to 2 years, and the focus of that is going to be to get you into industry, to working in the field right away, as opposed to being sort of an academic or a researcher. So at the professional science master's, you're going to gain skills that are more professional in nature, so maybe doing things that would get you into consulting or something of that nature. So there are a handful of schools that do that. I'm going to focus most of my talk here on the more research-oriented Masters of Science and PhD. If you think that you want to do research one day, you want to work for the U.S. Geological Survey, you want to work for one of the national labs, you want to work at a university, then you're going to ultimately want a PhD. In many cases, it can be beneficial to do a master's first. Doing that master's first allows you to take a project to completion, to see what that research experience is like. So you could then either stay at that school for a PhD or move on and do that PhD somewhere else. Now, I will point out there are some schools that will accept you for a PhD, and they want the master's to be your out if it's determined after a couple of years that maybe research science is not your path. You may think you really love this and find out, this is not where your greatest skills lie. Your greatest skills may lie in something else. In that case, they might say after a couple of years, you'll get a master's and be done. So you can pay attention to that. You can see if there are schools that have both or just one or the other. But if you are interested in, again, kind of working in industry or maybe not going into research science, a master's may be the goal, really may be the right degree for you. So you can also, I'll point out, for any of this stuff, ask your faculty, ask people you know who are in it, and they will also provide guidance about what the best path is for you. I'm a really big advocate of people doing a master's before a PhD because I think it helps to kind of spend that time doing research and see if it feels right to you. That said, I didn't do it myself. I was old by the time I got into my graduate program, and I knew I wanted to teach. I knew I wanted to get a PhD. So it isn't for everybody, but I think it's quite common. So I'll also point out that there are 2 categories of graduate programs. There are some schools that don't offer PhDs at all. I work at a school like that. Western Washington University only has a master's program. Others have both. And again, as I said, others accept people into PhD programs, and the master's is, to put it coarsely, sort of a consolation prize. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. So for example, I'll sing the praises of a master's terminal school where we don't have a PhD program. Our master's students are our top students. They get all of our focus. They get our emphasis. We have some funding opportunities because we're predominantly undergraduate, so sometimes we have a little more opportunity in those funding pools. And it allows us to work really closely with that sort of first scientific experience, first research experience. That said, we don't get as much funding as a PhD program. In a PhD program or a school with a PhD program, they may have more resources towards research. They may have resources towards libraries, which sounds like something you're not going to worry too much about until you're looking for a journal article and can't find it because your school can't afford the subscriptions. So there are advantages to being in that program. But you want to make sure if you're a master's student in a program that has both, that both levels are very well respected, that you don't feel like a second-class citizen. And similarly, that at a master's school, if you're interested in research, that it isn't focused only on sort of a more professional development. You'll find a school that's right for you, but this is a good thing to know about what direction they go. So let's talk a little more about how to find an advisor. And number one is talk to your professors. We've all been in graduate school, some of us less recently than others, but we might have an idea of, your interests. We might have an idea of people who are looking for students. We might know something about, wow, this person would be great to work with because they have, this particular skill set that matches yours. So that's really the first thing to do. The other thing is to think, well, why am I interested in this field? Well, I took this petrology class and I read this really, really fascinating paper. Who wrote that paper? Maybe look into that. See who's doing research that's intriguing to you. Small caveat, sometimes the author of the paper is a graduate student. So if you contact that person, you may find out that they don't take students because they are one. But you might find out who their advisor is. My goodness, if they've got their students publishing, that's a really good sign for your future. So you can look them up that way. Obviously, look them up on the web. You can both look up simply their names or research projects that are interesting. There's so many web pages that highlight exciting research. IRIS certainly has some wonderful highlights on both their web page and on their Facebook page. The American Geophysical Union will have exciting research, and see what people are doing, and feel free to look those people up. I'll talk a little later about the advantages of going to a scientific meeting, going to a conference. It's a great way to meet people and chat with them in person. And then look up their students. What are their students doing? Are their students getting research published? Are their students going to conferences? What are their students, what kind of research are they doing, and what are they engaged in? So these are things that you might investigate to find an advisor. You're going to want to ask as well what kind of advisor they are. Some advisors are really hands-off. They're looking for people who are very, very independent. Others really want to check in with you on a weekly basis. So feel free to ask either them or their students, what kind of advisor are they? How do you think you're going to work? You might know that, wow, I really want somebody who's going to kind of hold my hand at the beginning because I'm new at this. Or you might say, I don't want to talk to this person until I've got a draft I can hand in. Find out what kind of advisor they are by talking to their students. Once you've got a couple names, you're actually going to reach out to that person. And this is before the application process starts. I'm sure this is done differently at different schools, so I'll speak only for mine. I, as an advisor, am the only person, ultimately, who decides who's getting into graduate school to work with me. I am the person who accepts them, and if I accept them and the graduate school approves their application, which is just to say their GPA is high enough to meet a threshold, then they can come here. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. That doesn't mean this contact should be, anything other than an introduction, so that that person knows your name and they know that they should look for your application. In the case, again, of my school, if a student mentions that they've talked to me in their application, that application will be handed to me. It'll come to my desk, and then I can read it and I can follow up on the conversation. So you're going to send an introductory email, and it's going to be really simple. You're going to say who you are, maybe a little about when you graduated, etc. You're going to ask if they're taking students, because sometimes we have so many students we decide I'm taking a year off from anyone new. Other times we have a project that we really, really want someone to work on. So you'll say, I'm wondering if you're taking students, and I'm wondering if you have funding support for students. And we'll talk more about funding in just a second, but you'd like to know whether this is a good possibility for you. Many schools won't accept you if they don't have funding, and they may say, I'd love a new student, but I can't support one right now, so apply next year. But at least it gives you an idea of whether it's a waste of time to apply to work with that person. I often get asked by my students, well, what if they don't write back? What happens then? And I'll kind of give a couple possibilities for that. Number one, feel free to write again. Give it a week or two. Give it some time. Sometimes it takes us a while to get through our email. It's perfectly acceptable to write a follow-up. Hey, just checking to see if you got this. I'm interested in your program. I would say if they haven't written back a second time, don't nudge. After that, you're on their radar, hopefully. You might consider it a red flag as to whether this is somebody who's going to respond to your emails when you're a student, but ultimately they may genuinely be busy, they may be in the field, etc. But there's a boundary between being a nudge and not. Very important, this is a professional business letter. This is, you're going to write this and you're going to make yourself look good, okay? You are writing a formal letter. They are Dr. So-and-so until invited to call them by any other name. So, check your grammar. Have someone read over it. It doesn't have to be long or wordy. It's just a way to check in. But again, let yourself look good. This is their first encounter with you. So one of the things that I think a lot of people don't know about graduate school, particularly coming out of your graduate program, or excuse me, your undergraduate program, and you may have student debt, you may be paying off loans. This should not be the case for you for graduate school. That you should be paid to go to graduate school. Now, that may be different in some programs. For example, not all professional science masters, I think, can support it in the same way. I could be wrong about that. But hopefully you will get a tuition waiver and a stipend. And that stipend will be something for you to live on. And let's be honest, you're going to live on ramen, but you're going to not necessarily have to go deeper into debt. They're not going to pay huge, but it is a job. And that job takes kind of broadly two types. One is a research assistantship, an RA position. In that case, you're paid to do your research. So that is your job. That means, really you're expected to be in that lab doing that work the same time you would put to any job. But you will be paid. And the other possibility is that on top of your research, you will be paid as a teaching assistant, as a TA. So you might teach a lab, you might teach an intro class, you might just grade in a class. So those are possibilities for some schools and for some advisors who don't currently have research funding for a student. So there's a couple ways that can happen. There are also ways you can bring your own funding. National Science Foundation has fellowships. The Department of Energy has fellowships. There are some other ways that you can do that. And so I'll encourage you to either look on those websites or talk to faculty at your school for any advice on any fellowships they know of. But in those cases, you can come and say, look, I'm funded. I've got my support. Can I come? They're very competitive and they're very prestigious, but it's a wonderful way to come and work on a project that's interesting to you. Okay, so now you've picked a school, you've contacted somebody, they've said, yes, I've got funding for next year, I have money for a research assistant on such and such a project, and you're excited and you're going to do your application, and it asks you to write this personal essay. And pretty much all these personal essays are the same. They basically say, what you've been doing up to now, why do you want to go to grad school, and what are your plans for the future? I mean, that's kind of it in a nutshell. So you're going to write this statement. You're going to talk about what's interesting to you, why you want to do this, what your experiences have been that have led you into this, your motivation for graduate school, and what you want to do with it, what you see yourself doing. This doesn't mean you have to have your whole life planned out, but it lets them know kind of what you're in this for, and it helps them also know if your orientation in your career path is going to be well suited to their project. So you don't want to work with somebody who has a really different motivation than you. So that'll also help establish whether it's an appropriate program for you. One of the things that's really important is to show the school that you're applying there for a reason, that it isn't just, hey, I'm looking at graduate schools and here's one. So you're going to say in your essay, I contacted Dr. Caplan-Auerbach about her research on axial seamount, and I'm excited, I'm interested in that for the following reasons. But you'll show that you know exactly what this school is all about. You might say, I know that you guys have the lab facilities that are going to make some of these projects possible that I'm interested in. Or, I'm really excited to be at a school that has a connection with this, I don't know, this marine facility, this volcano observatory. Anything that shows you really understand that school. You're applying to that school because of who they are. And that lets them know you've done your homework. Again, if you've mentioned the names of faculty with whom you've spoken, then those faculty hopefully will see your application, and they'll be the ones to decide whether this is the right fit for them. So make sure you include that in your essay. Make this a good piece of writing. No typos, revise it, have somebody read over it. Take this one really, really seriously. I'm sure that goes without saying, but I'm saying it anyway. I often also get people who feel like this is their chance to show off what a creative writer they are. And they want to show that, they're very clever. And the problem is that while that is wonderful in many ways, that's not scientific writing. And you want to show that you can be concise and you can really be a good, strong writer without sitting next to a thesaurus. So don't worry about feeling like you need to be really clever and creative in that essay. That's not really what scientific writing is about. Just, write clearly, write well. Um, I cannot begin to tell you how many essays I read that start off with, I first got interested in geology when I had a rock collection as a child. Okay, great. We all had rock collections as children, whether or not we wound up in geology. We had pet rocks, whatever it might be. Probably not going to make you stand out. If you've got a story that stands out, tell that story. Anecdotes are fine. But make sure it's one that sits a little outside the box and not just kind of a standard thing. Don't feel like you have to, but you limit your stories to things that stand out. All right. So this is my little personal pet peeve, what I call, well, really what biologists call the charismatic megafauna problem. This comes from marine biologists who report that everybody who goes into marine biology says they want to study dolphins. Nobody wants to study sea cucumbers or algae. And the fact of the matter is, very few people study dolphins. So the charismatic megafauna of geology, there are several of them. It might be simply the opportunity to work in the field. It might be the opportunity to be Pierce Brosnan and be in Dante's Peak. But we tend to focus on these big, grand things that we want to do. And again, as somebody who studies volcanoes, I get a lot of applications from people who say, I really want to do volcano monitoring. Well, that's awesome. There's a small handful of people in the world who do volcano monitoring. There are way more people who study volcanoes. And nobody does a master's degree in volcano monitoring. People who monitor volcanoes are scientists who study the geology and the geophysics of volcanic systems. So ultimately, when they went to graduate school, they went to answer some scientific question about that volcano. That's what you are going to go to graduate school for. If, when you're done, there is a position at a volcano observatory that needs someone with your skills, that's awesome. But you're not going to go to graduate school to learn how to monitor. You're going to go to graduate school to learn about that research science. Similarly, if you get to do field work as part of your project, that's awesome. And it's totally fine to say, will I get to collect my own data? Do I get to go in the field? 95% of the time that you spend in your graduate program is not going to be in the field. It's not going to be dodging lava flows. It's going to be in the lab. It's going to be at your desk. It's going to be writing. It's going to be revising figures. It's going to be debugging code. That's really what you're doing. So it's great to get to do exciting things. But if that's your motivation, then you're really going to enjoy about 5% of your graduate program. You got to want to do the science badly enough. You got to want to answer those scientific questions enough to make it worth going. So feel free to say you're interested in those things, but make sure your application makes it clear that you know you're going there to be a scientist, not to be a volcano cowboy. Okay. I have a really brief thing on the GRE. Different schools may approach this differently. I think ultimately many of us treat the GRE as red flag, not red flag. Certainly if you do really well, that's great. That's a benefit for you. I know a lot of really great scientists who maybe don't do multiple choice questions real well. Not a huge amount of carryover between those two skills. So take the GRE. If you chunk it, consider taking it again. It's better if you do better, so spend some time studying. But ultimately, this is not the be-all and end-all. We're more interested in other aspects of your application. That said, you do need to take it. And again, some schools may take this more seriously than others. So I'm kind of going to leave it at that because it's very much advisor dependent. What is important, what is really critical, are your letters of recommendation. So This is something that you should start working on early. And I don't just mean asking for them early, although that's what it says on the screen. What's really, really important is that you spend a lot of your time as an undergraduate getting to know your professors enough that we can write you a good positive letter. There are people for whom all I can really say is, yeah, that person had, they were in my class and they were attentive and they turned in their homework on time mostly. But I can't say anything else because I don't know them. So I'll come back to this a little later. But get to know your professors enough that they can say positive things. Once you get to the point where you're asking for letters of recommendation, contact us early to ask. And the way I advise people to ask is not just, hey, will you write me a letter? And God forbid, I need a letter of recommendation. Here's the form. Make sure we're okay with it. So I encourage people to say, would you be able to provide a positive letter of recommendation for my application? And that way you know if it's going to be a good one. You can know that people are excited that they can provide not just a letter, but a positive one. It doesn't really take us that long to write a letter. Honest truth, it doesn't take that long. It takes a long time for your letter to rise to the top of our priority lists. It's not that you're not a priority. It's that we've got to grade papers for classes, and we've got to prep classes, and we've got papers to review, and we've got papers to write, and we've got data to process, and committees that we're sitting on. So give us a lot of time so we can schedule that letter in and get it to you on time. What I actually ask students to do is to provide me a copy of their CV, their resume, even if it's a draft, something about their personal essay, so I know what they're looking at. And what I really, really, really love is when students give me kind of a list. I'm applying to this school to work with this advisor on this project, and here's the due date. And then I've got everything right there, and I don't have to say, oh my goodness, did I forget that student letter? It's right there in front of me, and I know what to expect, and I can schedule. So basically, you want the person writing you a letter of recommendation to be really happy with you. So the more information you can provide them and make their lives easier, it is all to the good. So if it doesn't seem like they've written it, feel free to nudge. Again, fine line between nudging and nagging, so walk that line carefully. We will do it. But if you're worried that we're not on the ball, a nudge is okay. A nudge is okay. People often ask if they should get letters from, if it's okay to have a letter of recommendation from somebody outside their university, from a job or something like that. And I would say that really depends on who that person is. If you've been working a job that shows you have certain, say, organizational skills, interpersonal skills, if you have an employer who can really speak to that, that's great. If those skills are really not relevant to graduate school, better to ask faculty. Similarly, if you have a coach who thinks very highly of you, excuse me, unless your role on that team, again, speaks to skills that will be helpful as a graduate student, which is not hugely likely, stick to the academics. Those are the ones we need to hear from. All right, you've done this. You've been accepted. Life is good. If you can, go to the campus. Some schools will fly you out there. Some schools will invite you to come and join them, for a visit of new students. If they don't have the funds to do that, see if you can go. Because you'd like to meet your advisor. You'd like to meet their grad students. You'd like to talk to them. You see what it has been like to work with this person. You can discuss projects. You can see if you like the place. Find out what their expectations are of you. Find out how long it takes students to earn a degree there. If they say our students get out in 2 years, check and see if that's the case. You might be at a place where really people are taking 4 years to get through a master's. You might want to find out why. That might be okay with you, but you got to find out why. See when you run out of funding. Make sure people get along. Go to a place where people like each other. I can't stress enough how important it is to be in a community that supports each other. So if you can go to the campus, that's great. I actually want to kind of throw a couple things in here, and this is actually based on questions I've gotten from students. A lot of people say, I'm good enough for grad school. I don't know if I'm good enough. Should I even go? Should I try? And I kind of get this from both ends. I have students who don't think they're good enough and certainly are, and students who just expect they're going to go and haven't really paid attention to what it's going to take to get in. So I want to kind of tackle those briefly. first has to do with your GPA. Some schools have a GPA threshold, and they'll say you can't get in if your GPA is below this. Now, it may actually be possible to get into those schools, but more than likely you would be as a provisional student, which may mean they can't give you funding. So you're going to want to find out if your GPA is below that threshold, if there's any purpose to applying or not. Better get your GPA up so that's not an issue. Again, your GPA is only part of a whole application package, but it is the one thing I know of that can kill your application kind of sort of on the administrative end. The graduate school might have that cut off. So pay attention to that when you apply. I'll also note that different schools calculate it differently. It may be your last 90 credits. It may be your credits in your major. It may be all of your classes. Each individual school may calculate that differently, so you might want to find that out too. But the other thing I want to point out, and this came to me when I asked a lot of professors what advice they'd give, and a lot of people told me, research and classroom skills are really different. That sometimes you have students who really have good research skills. They're good troubleshooters. They're good question askers. They have creative ways of approaching a problem. That may not always be the same thing as a student who's excelling in the classroom. So you need to also kind of find out what your skills are. I'll talk in a second about opportunities to do that. But there are, again, the good classroom students are not always the good researchers, and vice versa. So in terms of whether you're good enough, you may have to do research to find out also. And I also just want to point out that there are some jobs out there for which graduate school is not the right direction. So again, if you have an idea for what you want to do, check out if graduate program is good for you. Find out whether you need a PhD or a master's, or again, a professional science master's might be a good opportunity. So again, talk to your faculty about your specific interests, because that might be something that you decide, maybe that's not my path. If you haven't applied yet, what do? Maybe you've got a year. Maybe you've got a little while. You're still going to be around for a year or two. Maybe you're going to take time off before you apply. What can you do to be a better student, or to be a better applicant, excuse me? So if you're an undergrad, see if you can do a research project. See if you can do a senior thesis. See if you can do an internship. Again, IRIS has wonderful internships. There's a Geologist in the Park program through the National Park Service. That's a great program for the Geological Society of America, or for the GeoCorps, I think. There are great opportunities to kind of find out what research is like and get experience. It tells you if you're interested. It tells prospective advisors that you have an idea of what it's like. I'm a huge fan of trying to attend a conference. If you've done some research, you might be able to present it, and that's super exciting. You can meet advisors there. Of course, you can learn new science. There are typically cheaper registration fees for students, so some of those are really affordable. If you can stack up a whole bunch of people in a hotel or stay in a hostel, it's really cheap. And that's a great way to find out what's going on and what people are doing. Going back to this idea of getting to know your professors, and I'm actually going to meld this with the last line that I have on here, this what's in your paragraph. This came to my department when we worked with people talking about how to be the best geology department we could be. And one of the things they said to us is, the first project they had this faculty do was to write a letter of recommendation for our ideal student. And just write a paragraph. What would we say about them? And we all did that. And then they said, do your students know this is what you're looking for? And the other way around was to ask the students, if the faculty have one paragraph to write about you, what are they going to say? What do they know about you? What's going to be in your paragraph? So going back to those letters of recommendation, make sure that we have stuff to put in that paragraph. Make sure that we have things to say about you. I want to be able to say not just that you did well in your exams, but that you showed interest in this topic that extended beyond what we did in class. That you were a problem solver, that you tried to tackle some of these questions on your own, that you tried to troubleshoot. There are lots of different skills we might look for that I'd like to celebrate, but if I don't know you, it's hard to do that. There are ways in which you can augment your transcript. Maybe take, I would say, any extra math and physics you can take is always better. If you're concerned about your GPA and you can take a couple more classes I'm not going to say take easy classes to bump it up, but I'm going to say if you have the opportunity to take more classes to improve your GPA, consider doing that if you need that. So if you have this time before applying, this is something you might do. People often ask me as well, what if they want to take time off? If they want to take a year off, take 2 years off. I myself took 6 years off between undergrad and grad school. I was a high school science teacher for many years. I'm not going to recommend you take 6 years off because there are a lot of things about how I applied that I would not recommend. But it's eminently doable. And one of the really important things that I'll stress is that you should not go to grad school if you're burned out. Not that you shouldn't go ever, but you shouldn't go right away. Grad school's hard. It's intensive. And if you're already feeling really burnt out and stressed, clear your head. Step away for a bit. You can come back. I personally love it when applicants have worked in the real world for some time, because it helps me know that they also have probably undergone maybe some maturing, maybe some real thought processes about the direction they want to take. But, don't go to grad school because you don't know what else to do. It's just too draining to start off that way. But if you have a cool job you want to work for a couple of years, do that job. That's great. That will not kill your chances. You might take the GRE before you get out of school, just to make sure you are kind of in that mode and you remember things like geometry. You might contact your professors for letters before you leave, just so that that's on their radar. I actually, when someone does that, I'll take some notes on them if I know they're not applying right away, so that I remember. So you might do that. Keep in touch with your professors if you think you're going to apply to grad school later. Let us know what's going on. We love that anyway. We love to know what you guys are doing. So if you do take time off, just stay in touch. Tell us what's going on. And then when you apply, you can write back and say, hey, I want to let you know what I've been up to. I started off with, I took 6 months off and I traveled the world. And when I did that, I found out I was much more interested in mountain building than I thought. But I went on these hikes and it blew my mind. And now I really want to go study, convergent margins and orogeny. Who knows? There might be things you find out. But tell us what you've been up to and what your plans are. And that stuff really helps us.